The story of Piet the Mouse. Sometime in the past, sometime in the present, or sometime in the future, there was a mouse colony that lived in a big tree trunk. The mice kept themselves busy by doing the same routine each day, involving moving their food supplies from the one side of the tree trunk to the other side, hereby keeping the food in the shade as the sun moved during the course of the day. And this was what mice did. It had made them successful for many years and had enabled the colony to successfully survive. Now Piet Mouse was one of the mice in the colony. One day, while doing his part in the daily food moving, Piet Mouse heard a roaring noise coming from a distance. He asked his friends whether they could hear the noise as well, but they told him to stop listening to noises and rather to do his duty in assisting them to move the food. This went on for a while, and each day Piet heard the roaring noise becoming louder and louder. One day, Piet Mouse decided to go and explore and find out what this roaring was and where it came from. He went out of the tree trunk and followed the roaring noise. On his journey, he met Mr. Raccoon. Piet asked the raccoon whether he could hear the roaring noise as well. Mr. Raccoon replied and said he knew where the noise came from. It came from the river. Mr. Raccoon told Piet that it wasn't safe for him to be outside of the mouse colony and that he must watch out for the big eye. Mr. Raccoon told Piet that he should rather return to his colony and help the other mice move the food, since this was what mice did. Piet Mouse returned to the colony and that evening shared his experience with his friends. All his friends were upset with him because he had left the colony and were very angry with Piet. Piet decided to go and explore the roaring noise further the next day and wanted to go to the river. He asked his friends to come along, but none of them wanted to go with him. The next morning, Piet went to explore again. He passed Mr. Raccoon, who told him to watch out for the big am, but Piet did not stop and went further on his journey. Eventually Piet got to the river. There he met Mr. River Frog. Mr. River Frog asked Piet why and how he, a mouse, had come to be at the river. Piet told Mr. River Frog his story. Mr. River Frog then told Piet that he would show him how to survive outside of the mouse colony and would show him what to eat, how to protect himself from the big am, and how to swim in the river. Piet was very excited. Mr. River Frog taught Piet everything he knew, and after a year and a day he told Piet to jump. This would be his last lesson for Piet. Piet started to jump, but Mr. River Frog told him to jump higher and higher. Eventually Piet started to jump higher than he had ever jumped before, and by jumping high in the air, he could see a mountain top in the distance. Piet was so excited about the mountain top and said to Mr. River Frog that he desperately would like to know how it felt to sit on top of it. Mr. River Frog understood. Piet decided to go on a journey to explore and reach the mountain top. He left Mr. River Frog, who told him to be incredibly careful of the big am, and went on his journey. Not far from the river he got to a big grass plain. On this grass plain a buffalo was running around and around in a circle. Piet was scared that the big am might catch him if he tried to cross the big grass plain alone and decided to talk to the buffalo. He met Mr. Buffalo and asked him why he was running around in a circle. Mr. Buffalo replied that he had lost his one eye and therefore could not run straight. Mr. Buffalo said to Piet that he had heard that if a magical mouse were to give him one of his eyes, he would be able to run straight again and possibly then be able to go and join his herd that were on migration. Piet Mouse thought by himself, he is not a magical mouse, but he could give Mr. Buffalo one of his eyes. He made a deal with Mr. Buffalo to take him across the plain if he would give him one of his eyes. Piet Mouse gave Mr. Buffalo one of his eyes, and immediately Mr. Buffalo was able to see again. Mr. Buffalo was so happy and immediately told Piet to climb onto his back so that he could take him over the grass plain. Mr. Buffalo took Piet across the plain, dropped him off at the foot of the mountain, bid farewell to Piet, and went off to join his herd on the migration. Piet immediately started to climb up into the mountain, over the big rocks, until he came across a mountain lioness. The lioness was crying. When Piet inquired as to why she was crying, the lioness told him that she had lost both her eyes in a fight and that she now was blind and could not find food or water anymore. She was almost starving. Piet told the mountain lioness that he was a magical mouse and that if he gave her one of his eyes, he was sure that she would be able to see again. The mountain lion was so grateful for Piet's suggestion and told him that this would be a great sacrifice for him to make. She asked Piet what she could do for him in return if he were to give her one of his eyes. Piet realized that he would not be able to get to the top of the mountain by himself. He was too small and the mountain too high. So, he asked her if she would take him to the top of the mountain if he gave her his eye. The mountain lioness told Piet that she would most definitely do this, but in order to do so, she would first need to have to go and find water and something to eat to get enough strength to climb the mountain. Piet agreed and decided to give the mountain lioness his eye. She kept her promise, and after finding some food and gaining some strength, she took Piet up to the top of the mountain. When they reached the top, Piet could feel the cold breeze on his fur and could sense the beauty of the view in front of him, and he felt a sense of accomplishment. He thanked the mountain lioness, who gently placed him on the top of the highest rock on the mountain. Piet sat and enjoyed the warmth of the rock and felt happy. Suddenly Piet felt a terrible pain in his back. Sharp claws pierced his skin, and he could feel how he was lifted up into the air. Higher and higher into the air. As Piet was moving higher and away from the mountain top, he could sense where he was. He could sense the mountain lioness on the rocks, he could sense the buffalo running on the grass plain down below with his herd, and slowly he began to hear the familiar roar that had first called him from the mouse colony. He sensed that he was nearing the river where Mr. River Frog and he had spent time together. Piet, as loud as he could and with the last bit of energy he had shouted down, "Hello, Mr. River Frog." Mr. River Frog looked up in the direction of the greeting, saw and replied from far beneath, "Hello, Big I Am."